So let's say that you have a sock or another knit item that has a pretty large hole in it, something that is bigger than your thumb, for instance. That's really a lot harder to fix. Now you can go ahead and make a small knitted patch, and you can sew that knitted patch to the edges of the hole, and remember to overlap it so that your hole doesn't creep out from underneath your patch. Another way that you can do it is you can address it like a woven patch on a small hole, but let's take a look at either option for a larger hole. So when we talk about fixing bigger holes, this sock, for example, has a pretty good sized hole in the heel, but I can probably still use the woven method to fix this hole. Now, this sock has already been patched once, but then it wore through next to the patch. This is why it's really important to make sure that you go a little bit further than you think you need to when you're making your patches. So this one is a candidate for a small knitted patch, but it's also a candidate for another woven patch. But I want to show you how to install both. So I'm going to go ahead and use my sock over here to install a small knitted patch. I'm only going to make it large enough to cover the hole, so it'll probably be about 8 stitches wide and about 10 stitches tall, and again, just wide enough that it will cover that hole. Now, I normally wouldn't do that for a sock because it's going to add some thickness to the bottom of the sock, but I think in this case it's going to be okay, and I wanted to show you how to do that small knitted patch. So now that I have knit my small patch for the hole in my heel, it's time to attach it, and you'll notice that I left the ends rather long because I'm going to use those little ends to actually sew my patch down. So I wouldn't normally put a patch on the sock because that is going to add thickness, especially at the base of that heel, but I'm going to show you how to do it because I happen to have a sock with a hole in it. Usually this kind of patch is used for a sweater, and it's used for elbows, or it might be used somewhere on the body of the sweater. When I go to attach my little patch, I want to make sure that I am attaching it to stitches that are not compromised by that hole. So what I want to do is make sure that I am attaching it around that hole. So here I am with my sock, and you can see the rather large hole in the bottom, and here is my little patch. So I fit my patch to my sock to make sure that it works, and then I take my yarn and I go ahead and thread it on and just pick a spot on the sock and start whip stitching it down. Now you can use a more decorative stitch like a blanket stitch, especially on something like an elbow or a cardigan, a sweater of some sort, where you'd like to make it prettier. But the whip stitch works just fine for our demonstration purposes, and all I'm trying to do is attach each stitch from the sock to the patch until I have one side done. And once you have the first side done, it's much easier to do the other sides. So all I'm going to do is go ahead and whip stitch these down. You can see I'm just lining up each stitch of each row of the sock with each stitch of each row of my patch. And what I'm going to do is when I get to this corner, because I have a second end to put in, I'm going to go ahead and switch my yarns and use the other end as I stitch across the third and fourth side of my patch. And I want to make sure that I stretch that patch just a little bit, just so that it's past that hole. You want to make sure that when you are stitching it down that you are not stitching into the edges of the hole. And you want to make sure that you're going in the correct stitch across the top of the patch. So once I get my third side done, then we'll move on to the fourth side. And again, it's always a little bit easier when you can line up a row of the patch with a row of the knitting. And adjusting that darning egg can make a big difference as you go along, just moving it for your comfort and to make sure that the patch is stretched well enough across that hole. So as soon as you have your patch completely sewn on, you can put in your ends and consider it done. So now that I have patched that heel, I'll put my ends in just like I did with the other items that we patched. And again, because this is a sock, I wouldn't normally do a sewn patch. Usually I would do a woven patch because, again, you're going to be walking on this, and the edges, which have extra thickness, are going to be really uncomfortable when you're walking. So I'll probably take that off for my own personal use, but I wanted to show you again how to put on one of those little knit patches as opposed to doing a woven patch, because again, this is a really useful technique to know when you need to patch an elbow or maybe patch a shoulder seam or something like that. So I hope that you've had a great time learning how to darn those holes, and you'll join me for another class.